Germany was described by one journalist after the war as a garbage heap with 40 million hungry Germans cowering in it. The country's post-war reality was truly harsh. Defeat in the Second World War resulted in the loss of 29% of the territory, with the remainder divided into 4 occupation zones. More than 7 million men died and more than 2 million were maimed. To make matters worse, Germany had to pay a $500 billion contribution to the victorious countries, and the victors were allowed to take resources, factories, and even entire power plants out of Germany. Despite this, the country managed to reach pre-war production levels in 3 years, and by the mid-60s Germany had become the most industrialized country in continental Europe. Automobiles, machinery, food, medicine. Germany spanned the globe. How did a devastated country manage to become the most industrialized country in Europe in just 20 years? And why did the United States, which was at war against the Third Reich, become active in promoting the welfare of German citizens? Questions about Germany's post-war development began to be raised even before the end of World War II and were actively discussed at the Yalta Conference in 1945. Germany was divided into 4 sectors or occupation zones of influence: Soviet, British, American, and French. The Soviet zone of influence developed autonomously. Until December 2, 1946, the American and British sectors of influence were combined into one, called Bisonia from the Latin words for two and zone, to simplify economic ties and political administration. Later in 1949, the French sector of occupation joined Bisonia to form 3 zones, which transformed into the Federal Republic of Germany in the same year, 1949. The Soviet zone of occupation became the German Democratic Republic (GDR), and West Berlin was given a special status. The post-war division of Germany was completed, and history began to be written by the victors. The defeated Germany was completely under the control of the Anglo-American Soviet coalition. Decisions about its future were made across the ocean. There were 2 options for development. The first was Morgenthau's plan, which envisioned the complete destruction of the country's industry and the division of Germany into several small states. However, this plan was not accepted. First, other capitalist countries feared the spread of communism. Germany had a significant border with the socialist camp, which effectively made it the protector of capitalism in the East. Therefore, the country had to be strong, first of all economically. Secondly, the world expansion of the dollar and American goods in Europe had begun, for which Germany had to be rich. This is why the Morgenthau Plan was replaced by the Marshall Plan, which provided significant economic aid to the defeated country. The problems to rebuild Germany's economy were plenty. First, many factories were completely destroyed or taken to the victorious countries. To cite just one example, the BMW plants. The factories located in Brandenburg were taken to the USSR, and the factory in the suburbs of Munich was destroyed. Secondly, there was an acute shortage of qualified personnel. Many men died in the war or were disabled, and many engineers who had collaborated with Hitler, and most of them were on his side, left Germany. Some went to the USSR, others to the United States. The most famous example is rocket engineer Wernher von Braun, designer of the Pfau rocket, who became one of the founders of the American space program. The unequal status of women also played a role. In the USSR, women worked alongside men, and there were many skilled engineers, workers, and managers among them. In the Third Reich, the situation was different. Most women were engaged in family and household chores, with no higher or specialized technical education and no experience in factories. Moreover, in the last years of the war, much of industry shifted to war production. For example, BMW produced engines for airplanes and rockets. After the war, military production in Germany was banned and technical documentation was sent to the victorious countries. In addition, the banking system was completely destroyed and the black market flourished. These products were distributed on cards. The morale of the losing country was at a low level. How were these problems solved? Surprisingly, the first aspect that was solved was the shortage of personnel. Residents of the territories that had fallen away from the USSR and Poland began to come to Germany. Thanks to them, the population of the country increased by more than 2 million people. Secondly, the economic crisis in Germany played a positive role in the development of industry. The labor force became available, and the whole world recognized the excellent quality of German goods. Third, Americans began to supply new technologies and equipment to Germany. Fourth, military factories were reoriented to the production of consumer goods. The first buyers of German products were, surprisingly, the British and Americans. One of the most famous cars of the XX century, Volkswagen Beetle, which is one of the symbols of the 50s and 60s, became an illustration of this process. Few people know that Volkswagen production began back in 1945. The first 50 cars were produced for the needs of the British Army, which needed affordable and reliable cars. This was followed by an order for another 20,000 cars. It would have been much more expensive to produce similar cars in the United States or Britain, so until the late 40s cars were produced exclusively for military needs. Then cars became widely available and popular among ordinary people in Germany. German automakers were not lagging behind. BMW, unable to produce cars, focused on making cheap motorcycles. Some of Opel's production was moved to the USSR, which led to the start of production of the Moskvich 400, a model that was a copy of the Opel Kadett. However, the plant received an order to produce trucks for the US Army. The Audi plant also entered the production of motorcycles and small vans. By the early 1950s, the German automobile industry had reached pre-war production levels and continued to grow. Oddly enough, the Korean War in the 1950s had an impact on the development of German automobile production. Germany became a major supplier of automobiles to the US and British armies. Thus, North Korea indirectly influenced the development of the German automobile industry. One of the leaders of the economic boom was Ludwig Erhard, a prominent economist. Under his leadership, a currency reform was implemented in which unsecured money was exchanged for the new German mark at a ratio of 10-to-1. There was also a liberalization of prices, which led to the disappearance of the black market and the availability of goods in stores. The government also regularly issued catalogs with recommended prices. Several key industries, including energy, were under government control. There was also an official exchange rate between the German mark and the dollar. However, currency conversion was only possible with government authorization. Over time, wages began to rise, and with them, purchasing power. However, the most significant thing was that the income earned by businessmen was not used for consumption, but was invested in the development of production. The emphasis was on the development of small and medium-sized businesses rather than large corporations. In the mid-1950s, the German domestic market was saturated with goods, and it became necessary to enter foreign markets. There was an artificial devaluation of the German mark, which fell to the dollar by a third. This made German goods more competitive on the world market. Above all, German cars were popular. In the 1950s, the Volkswagen Beetle became the most popular car in Europe, becoming a true people's car, not only in Germany. Of course, Germany sold not only cars, although their production from 1948 to 1953 increased more than 7 times, but also household appliances. Famous were refrigerators from Bosch and Siemens, as well as household appliances from Grundig and many others. The pharmaceutical industry was also actively developing. It is worth noting the concern Bayer, revived in 1952, which was headed by those convicted during the Nuremberg trials and fully served their sentences. Americans also invested heavily in the company. Bayer was one of the first major German companies to open branches in third countries. In 1954, the company began operating in the United States and later expanded into India and Pakistan. At the same time, new neighborhoods of residential buildings were being actively constructed in Germany. It is important to note that these were not temporary buildings but real houses built for many years. Various mortgage programs were offered, including special conditions for the poor. Large families had the opportunity to get interest-free loans for housing for a long period of time. By 1963, there were 30 apartments for every 100 Germans, while in the USSR affordable housing was just beginning to be built and most city dwellers lived in communal apartments. At that time, affordable housing was also being actively developed outside the city, where it was cheaper to get your own house with a plot of land than to buy a city apartment. The German economic miracle came in the mid-1960s. At this time, Germany had high wages and a strong social safety net. This put serious pressure on business. German goods were no longer competitive, and even Volkswagen was on the verge of bankruptcy in the late 1960s because of Japanese automakers who were beginning to compete vigorously in the world market. The energy crisis of 1972 to 1973 also played an important role by increasing the cost of energy. This led to a slowdown in production growth. However, the economy was saved by small and medium-sized businesses, which have always been more flexible than large corporations. At the same time, unemployment began to rise, especially among migrants from Turkey and Yugoslavia, who had been actively recruited in the 1960s. How did the Germans find a way out of this situation? In the 1970s, Germany, like many other European countries, entered the post-industrial era. Given the high energy costs in Europe, most energy-intensive and environmentally harmful industries were outsourced to third-world countries. In fact, only high-tech manufacturing remained in Germany. It began to invest its financial resources abroad. In the 1970s, about 30% of German investments were directed to foreign production, which formed a parallel economy. Large international corporations began to play an important role. Markets expanded significantly and a new economic boom began in the mid-1980s. In addition, one of the main consumers of German goods became the countries of the socialist camp. This led to the fact that by 1990 Germany's economic performance had reached its highest values in the last 20 years. However, this period of happiness was short-lived. Germany was facing a crisis without precedent in its history. Its causes were numerous. First, the unification of Germany into a single state. The GDR was characterized by much less industrial development and required huge investments, becoming a de facto region requiring subsidies. In the first half of the 1990s alone, more than $500 million German marks were invested in the eastern regions. Most of these funds were directed not to industry but to social infrastructure, which ultimately proved ineffective. The second important factor in the crisis was the collapse of the socialist camp. Germany lost a large market, which led to the rapid replacement of German goods with cheaper counterparts from Turkey or China. Capital began to flow abroad. Strict austerity measures were imposed on public funds. However, the problems began to be solved. Tax reform was carried out, East German enterprises were integrated into the economy, and changes were made in the scientific field. Until the 1990s, Germany was mainly dependent on foreign scientific developments. However, then huge sums of money were poured into the development of new technologies. As a result, the country began to export its own technologies quite quickly. Today, the German economy continues to lead in Europe, and after Britain's exit from the European Union, Germany has only strengthened its position. However, not everything is so rosy. In many ways, the prosperity of the German economy was promoted by cheap energy resources, such as gas or oil, which Germany received from Russia. Now the situation is changing. There are no supplies, and environmental groups are pressing for a faster transition to renewable energy sources, which are much more expensive. The situation is complicated by fierce competition with Southeast Asian countries, as well as increasing social problems and an aging population. Currently, the average age of German residents is 44 years. For comparison, in Russia this indicator is about 40 years old, and in the USA and China 38 years old. The number of pensioners is constantly growing, and all of them are striving for higher pensions. The social crisis intensified during the pandemic, when many businesses were forced to suspend operations, but people continued to receive substantial benefits. Tensions between the local population and immigrants from Eastern Europe and Africa are increasing. Could these problems lead to a new crisis? How serious it will be, and whether the Bundestag will be able to lead the country out of it again, time will tell. But one thing is certain: today's Germany is no longer the same country that 80 years ago was able to create an economic miracle unprecedented in history. Thank you, dear friends, for joining me on this fascinating journey through history. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new videos about exciting events and facts from the past. Also, leave your comments below this video. I'm always happy to hear your thoughts, suggestions, and requests for topics for future videos. See you all again on the channel.